we have these capacities in our brains that allow us to have this extra voice, that have this extra view of how you're doing at any one moment. There's lots of then benefits that flow from that. If you are able to realize when things might be going off track, you can intervene and prevent errors happening. You can change strategies. You can communicate to others when you think that the group needs to change course, the company needs to change course.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the HR Leaders Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Steve Fleming, who's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College London and author of the book Know Thyself, The Science of Self-Awareness. During the episode, Steve shares why self-awareness is humans' greatest superpower and guides our mind, memory, creativity, intelligence, and skill to perform at our best. As always, before we jump into the video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow on your favorite podcast platform. With that being said, let's jump in. Steve, welcome to the show. How are you?
Excellent. Pleasure to be here.
You've got a smile and energy of someone who's just gone back from holiday.
It's been a few weeks back in the office, but still, trying to build off that energy, off that glow.
We came across each other through our shared friend, John Gomez, and he told me a little bit about your work, and it just immediately, I was sort of fascinated. But tell everyone a little bit more about your background and the journey to where we are now.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist based at UCL, at University College London. So I originally trained in psychology, and then I did a PhD in neuroscience, in brain imaging. And since then, I've had a real interest in understanding how metacognition works. So this is the part of the human mind that allows us to think about our own thoughts and feelings, reflect on our behaviors, think about whether things are on track, off track, and so on. So it's really a component, a major component of what we think of as self-awareness. What we're interested in doing, and what I've been doing since I started my lab at UCL, is using brain imaging tools to study how self-awareness works in the brain.
Maybe just start with breaking it down for everyone, because I've also been on the journey of discovery since we last spoke. What is the role of self-awareness?
Yeah, so self-awareness shapes almost everything we do. We often don't think about it like that. We often think of it as something specific. In a way, it's like the conductor of an orchestra. It's kind of in the background, but it's critical to high performance. So if I'm carrying out some task at work, then I might stop and think to myself, is this the right way of going about it? And that is me being self-aware of how I am performing the task. So you can immediately see that if someone has good self-awareness, you're able to just intervene at just the right moment on yourself, on your own performance, and stop yourself going off track. And that's what we think metacognition, self-awareness gives us, is this is essentially a superpower. It gives us this ability to see ourselves like others see us. So it's really hard to do. We often do rely on other people to get that third person perspective, to get that advice on whether things are going well or badly. But if you have good self-awareness, you can almost do that for yourself.
Are some people naturally more self-aware?
Yeah, we think so. So one of the challenges in the lab has been to develop a rigorous scientific way of quantifying self-awareness. The way we study it is by giving people tasks to do, cognitive tasks, and then we ask them every so often to reflect on how well they think they're doing on those tasks. And so we can then define a measure of self-awareness, which is whether your performance lines up with your judgments of how well you think you're doing. And we find that some people have good awareness of how they're doing, and other people have really poor awareness of how they're doing. And that tends to generalize across lots of different tasks that we give people. So there seems to be some kind of common resource that we use to reflect on ourselves, and some people are better at it than others. Yeah. And we've linked that in our studies. We've linked that to features of the anatomy and the function of the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex towards the front of the brain seems to be really important for supporting good self-awareness.
I'm interested to know how our upbringing and environment affect our ability to be self-aware.
Great question. It's something that we don't know a huge amount about. It does seem to take a while to develop in kids. So when you take these measures that I just described and you give them you develop versions of these self-awareness tests for young kids, then you find that it's not until the age of around 3 or 4 that kids start to essentially be able to realize that they might be wrong about something. So that's the hallmark of good self-awareness. They can still do things, right? So I see this in my own kids. I've got a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. My 1-year-old can start to talk a bit and so on, but it's not until they're a bit older that they can realize that they might have used the wrong word or written down the wrong answer. And that all takes a while to come online. And so one hypothesis, but it really is just an idea at the moment, and we wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago with some colleagues in Oxford, is the idea that the reason it takes a while to develop is not an accident. It's because you need to, in a sense, learn to be self-aware
through the experiences,
through experiences, and by listening to your parents, to your teachers. In a sense, they're teaching you how to realize that you might be wrong about things. That's the idea.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Exactly.
So you learn the way. Is metacognition the same as self-awareness?
No, we don't think it's the same. We think it's one important building block. Many animal species, for instance, have forms of metacognition, but we think that fully fledged human self-awareness requires something additional, which is the ability to gain this third person perspective. So you can have metacognition in the sense that you can have a sense of confidence that you might be right or wrong, but that might not be gaining this fully fledged view of yourself. And we think that extra component of self-awareness, that the ability to, in a sense, see yourself like other people see you, relies on a social ability. So when kids gain the ability to realize that other people have a different view of the situation to them, that's what psychologists call theory of mind, or mentalizing, thinking about other people. Then the idea is that you can then start to apply that to yourself as well. And that's what we think creates human level self-awareness. So metacognition is an important building block of self-awareness, but it's not the only thing that you need.
Because when I first spoke to John Gomez, and I explained it to you after, and he said, hey, you should chat, is for years I was always trying to explain to friends, family members and colleagues that I always felt like I had this voice. And I use an example. Whenever I was selling to a client, I had this separate Chris I always describe was sitting on my shoulder whilst I'm talking, observing the conversation. And I would ask myself questions like, how's this call going? Where should you go with this? What is his need? And whenever I explained that to people, they thought I was crazy. Like, what are you talking about? I was like, I can't explain it any clearer than that. Like, when I'm in a conversation, there's this other version of me that's kind of guiding me. And for years, I could never put a name on it until I spoke to you, and you was like, that's metacognition. I was like, absolutely. Oh, finally, it made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of, I think you described it beautifully there, this idea that essentially we have these capacities in our brains that allow us to have this extra voice, that have this extra view of how you're doing at any one moment. We found not just us, but many labs around the world have found that the same brain systems that are engaged by metacognition, by thinking about yourself, are also engaged by thinking about other people. So essentially, imagine if you're watching someone else do the job and you're thinking, are they doing that okay or not? Right. So it's essentially the same system. What you described there is the ability to use that system on yourself. So there's a huge amount of positive benefit that flows from this relatively minimal capacity to take a third person perspective on yourself.
What are some practical things that we can do to improve our self-awareness?
One is, on the more practical side, just recognizing failure modes of metacognition. We know that, for instance, self-awareness is quite fragile. As I just described, if you have too much stress, if you have poor mental health, if you are in a situation where you're doing a task for the first time, for instance, like it's not very well practiced, then your confidence might be completely off. You might think you know it when you actually don't. So there's plenty of situations where metacognition can essentially decouple from reality. It's in those situations where I think two things really help. One is just having a conversation like this, learning a bit more about how metacognition works. That's partly why I wrote the book, which was to essentially put some of this science out there so that people can understand a bit more how this system works. And if they know the failure modes, they can avoid those failure modes. Mm-hmm. And another one is just to recognize that, like, because metacognition, like any mental faculty, has limits, we want to rely not just on metacognition, but also rely on other people. So other people are the best third person perspective, in a sense. Like we do have this ability to call on the advice of others and essentially put in place a wider network of that external perspective. So that's more the practical side, like just learning a bit more about those failure modes, and when those failure modes might occur, make sure we attend a bit more to other people and less to our metacognition. So I mean, one example I have from my own life is that sometimes when I get very stressed with work, if I'm writing grants or things are stressful in the lab, then I can be maybe not very pleasant to live with at home. And I don't necessarily have the self-awareness of that, right? So, but after the fact, my wife might say to me, like, you know, you realize you're a bit stressed the past few days. It hasn't been that fun. And like paying attention to that and realizing that she was probably right and I was probably wrong about that is helpful. And then another route is more experimental. I think we're at early stages on this in terms of the research, but there's some empirical evidence to suggest that some form of regular training of metacognition can be helpful. So one route that we're pursuing in the lab is by giving people little games to play where they can essentially get feedback on whether their confidence, whether their self-assessments are accurate or not. And that seems to have some benefit. And another route that might be much more widely applicable is engaging in regular meditation, regular self-reflection. And there's been some evidence from studies of people who've gone into a meditation retreat, for instance, that after that retreat, they have better metacognition when we measure it in the lab. Essentially trying to build up this muscle. It's obviously not a muscle, but the analogy would be that trying to build up this capacity for metacognition might benefit from some form of dedicated training.
I suppose the more for the first part you mentioned, the more you learn, and even since we first spoke, you sort of catch yourself in the moment and go, because now you can recognize the signs and the patterns because you know, the more you learn about it. You mentioned animals earlier. What's the difference between the self-awareness of animals versus human beings?
Yeah, I mean, animals share many of the same algorithms, if you like, in the brain for self-monitoring. So they can track how confident they are about certain actions. They can realize when they might have made an error and switch away from doing that. So this has been studied a lot in rodents, in other animals, especially in neuroscience. As I mentioned before, that kind of metacognition, that low-level ability to track your errors, is only one small component, or it's an important one, but it's only one component of seeing yourself as a self, as a mind, as having particular goals, intentions, thoughts, behaviors, and so on. And we think building up that picture of yourself is something that might be uniquely human. Now, I put might there because there are some really interesting studies of chimpanzees, of other great apes, that they also might be able to essentially see themselves in that way. There's ongoing experimental work trying to study that in chimpanzees and other great apes. But what is clear is that there seems to be a transition around the age of 3 or 4 as children, as human children, where you gain that, oh yeah, I'm a person, I have a mind, I might see things this way, you might see things that way. And we gain that model of ourselves and we carry that around with us for the rest of our lives. It changes, it evolves, it is shaped by different experiences. But there does seem to be something important about that developmental stage in kids. And so then the question is, is that shared with other animals? And we think probably not to a very large degree. Yeah. There might be other animals that have parts of it, like being able to recognize yourself in the mirror or being able to track your own errors and so on. But in terms of the whole package, we think that might be unique to humans.
Lots of buzz right now around AI, ChatGPT, and we can't get away from it at the moment. Every time you turn on social media or the TV, what are you seeing how AI is going to shape self-awareness and metacognition?
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. And as you say, I think these things are evolving so quickly that it's hard to say that things won't have this or will have this. But what we can say is that at the moment, at least, it seems that the architectures that drive a lot of generative AI at the moment, like ChatGPT, are incredibly powerful and resourceful. They've been trained on huge amounts of data. But what they don't seem to have, at least in terms of, they don't have that because they can pass a lot of the tests. The irony is they can pass a lot of the tests that have been developed to test human metacognition. So they're able to generate statements of confidence in their knowledge and so on. So at the moment, it's kind of like a scientific intuition that they don't have this capacity for metacognition. But I wouldn't rule out the fact that it couldn't emerge in future iterations of the model. So it might be that they do develop metacognition in some form or another. In a way, that could help us interact with AI of the future. So if you imagine, say, a self-driving car engineered with a minimal form of metacognition, it could then signal whether it knows that it has the right view of the scene. It could realize that it's out of its comfort zone and can hand back control to the driver and so on. So there could be a lot of benefit actually from building in artificial metacognition. We've got a project ongoing with a group of roboticists in Oxford where we're trying to explore some of these questions. The other side of the coin is like, how does the potential emergence of artificial intelligence, artificial metacognition, how might that impact our own self-awareness, our own way of thinking about ourselves? And this is, again, a big open question. You might imagine that if we outsource more and more to AI, then we have less need to essentially reflect on whether what we're doing is the right thing, because we'll essentially have like handed over to the AI the responsibility for making decisions about what movie to watch or what restaurant to go to. Then we have less need to perhaps introspect about whether we're making the right decision. So there's something quite interesting about how this kind of like future cultural evolution of interactions between machines and humans might affect our own cultural evolution of metacognition and self-awareness. So it's very hard to know which way it will go, but it is a fascinating subject.
I'm already seeing that where I'm using OpenAI to create a lot of content. And in the past, I was forced to really think and internally and reflect on how I'm writing, what am I writing about? Is it coming off to right? Is it delivering value? Is it delivering the right message? Is it inclusive? You know, all of these questions I'm asking myself. Now, when I'm asking that to generative AI and it gives me this amazing response, I'm asking maybe one or two of those questions now, and just trusting the reply way more than I should be, because it's quicker, it's easier, and I've got other work to do.
I've actually got a postdoc in my group who's studying this. She's running experiments where we ask people, how confident do you think the AI is? We ask that question both of whether you think the AI is confident, but also whether you think a human making a very similar decision, a very similar choice is confident or not. And what we find is that even though we show people exactly the same data, if we label that data as coming from an AI, they will trust it a bit more. They will also think the AI is more confident that it knows how to produce this response than the human, even though it's identical in both cases. So there's essentially, just as you described, there's a kind of like implicit level at which we just offload. We just hand over responsibility. We think, I'm confident that you know what you're doing, and I'll trust that response. And that might be fine in domains where it really has more data and more knowledge than us, but it might be also dangerous.
What about sort of dreaming and self-awareness? Because we all kind of like have these moments where like I feel like I've had a dream about something and then it's kind of come to life in reality, and I'm like, I'm sure I dreamed about that a few weeks ago and now it's happened. But what's going on here? What's the science around that?
Yeah, I mean, dreaming is fascinating and very poorly understood relative to other aspects of brain function. But what we do know is that there's a phenomenon known as lucid dreaming, where you essentially become self-aware of the fact you're dreaming. I've only had one lucid dream that I can remember. I remember sleeping on a sailing boat moored up, and I was very tired. I think being very tired is a predictor of having a lucid dream. And I remember essentially dreaming that I was flying through the boat, but then realizing I was dreaming and then being able to control the fact I was flying through the boat. And it was kind of an amazing experience, like hallucinating, but in your dream. What's been found, there's very little science on this because it's incredibly difficult to measure, but it is possible to bring people into the lab, get them to fall asleep, and then get them to lucid dream and monitor when they start lucid dreaming. And what's been found is that the mechanisms in the brain that support lucidity during dreams seem to be related to the mechanisms that support self-awareness when you're awake. So there's kind of a nice symmetry there, that essentially like being more self-aware when you're awake might be being a bit like becoming lucid in a dream. You start noticing things that you didn't notice before. And there's been a really clever study that was done just a few years ago recently, where applying weak electrical stimulation to the prefrontal cortex, to the regions of the brain that we think are important for metacognition, was able to slightly increase the frequency of lucid dreaming. So essentially like pushing the brain to be aware of the fact it was dreaming, and that seemed to work in that particular study. So it's an amazing area of research, and we don't know very much about it, but there does seem to be a really intriguing connection between lucidity during dreams and self-awareness.
So what I started doing is creating a playlist like of affirmations and I am statements, etc., that I would kind of play on a loop, listen to it for 8 hours straight whilst I'm asleep. And when I wake up in the morning, it just makes me feel amazing, because the whole 8 hours I've been told how grateful I am, I'm going to succeed, I'm going to get this, and it's all like as if I've already got it, I am. And that was a big one for me.
It's making me think of two things. So one is, there has been some really cool research done, as colleagues of mine in Paris, showing that when you bring people into the lab and let them sleep, you can then play them things through the headphones while they're asleep. So they don't remember it at the time, but you can decode the information going into the brain, and you can train them to respond to certain words that are being played during sleep. So essentially, just as you described, like there is a real sense in which that information is being processed unconsciously when you're playing it through your headphones when you're asleep. The other thing to say about that is this now making me think of this promising theory of what it means to be conscious. So there's this open question in science, like a big question, like what distinguishes conscious versus unconscious processing in the brain? And we don't really have a good understanding of that. But one promising theory, this is a colleague of mine in Japan, a guy called Hakuan Lau. His idea is that what it means to be conscious is essentially a system in the brain tagging something as being real, as opposed to being imagination or dreams or anything else, right? So that implies, and I'm only just thinking about this now, which is a really cool conversation to be having. So like that implies that the unconscious doesn't have that reality monitoring system. So if you're playing in information, as you say, there could very well be a sense in which that information is just incorporated into how the brain is doing its thing without some higher system saying, hang on, I need to ignore that because it's not real. It's being played through my headphones. It's just me trying to trick myself. So if you're essentially trying to trick yourself unconsciously, then it starts to be treated as real when you wake up. So it's a really cool phenomenon. Yeah.
Let's see. I feel like I could talk to you forever, and I know I've got to let you go. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it. And for everyone listening, make sure you grab a copy of Know Thyself. There'll be a link in the description as well. Steve, where can everyone connect with you if they want to reach out as well? What other places? Probably
the best place is on my lab website, where we collect all our information about what we're working on. So that's metacoglab.org. So if you go there, there's links to the book, there's links to recent news from the lab, papers, videos, podcasts, everything. So check that out. That's where we are.
Well, I think you're going to have a lot of people wanting to reach out to you as well. But listen, I wish you all the best until next week, and I look forward to the next book. Sounds like you've got a lot of things that haven't been tested. You've got plenty of work to do ahead of you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Chris. It's been great.
Thanks. Bye.